Hello and good at whatever current time you're watching this video. I've been busy. I went on a big trip and I'm in the middle of moving. So I've got a couple of big videos coming up that aren't like this, but I saw this video and I wanted to quickly do a sort of beat by beat sort of response. So this is a video by Dr. Frank Turek on why the quote multiverse theory fails. And I want to sort of preface this by pointing out two things. Number one, Dr. Frank Turek doesn't have any credentials in the world of physics whatsoever. And number two, as we go through this video, we're going to see that Frank Turek doesn't actually mention any scientific reason for why the multiple worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics doesn't work. And that's going to be important for us because really this isn't a question as to whether or not multiverse theory fails. In reality, the multiple worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is a sort of transient pending notion within the world of science. In other words, it's not a complete yes, but it's also not a complete no. So for Frank Turek to tell us that it's an instant no, just without even starting, I think is tells a lot about his bias.
Some have proposed, in order to refute the argument for the complexity of the universe and its fine-tuning, that perhaps infinite, all possible universes exist, and thus we just happen to be in the one that could support life to see it. Could you respond to...
Okay, so let's just start off with that argument, because that is a very popular argument made by a lot of atheists. And my analysis of that argument comes down to that the vast majority of atheists that make that argument are woefully uneducated, not only on quantum mechanics, but on how the, quote, multiverse, for the layman, actually works. It's not that simple. It just straight up isn't that simple. I hate to sort of break it down and not really like give a full explanation, but it's just not that simple. That's just how it is. It's just not that simple. It is true that we could be the only sort of form of existence that does have life, but it's not a guarantee. The proper wording would be life as we know it. Life as we know it only exists in this universe, but that doesn't mean it can't exist in other universes. So that argument in on itself is fundamentally weak, just on the face of it. So already we're starting off with an incredibly weak argument that relies on a lack of education on the topic. But let's see what Frank Turek actually has to say on the topic.
The multiverse hypothesis?
Yeah, sure. The multiverse, easy for me to say, the multiverse hypothesis is relatively new and really...
No, it isn't. No, it is not. First off, the multiverse hypothesis doesn't exist. It's called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, and it was first proposed by Hugh Everett in 1957. So if almost 70 years is new, then we've got problems. Because relatively speaking, in conjunction with quantum mechanics as we know it today, multiple worlds is relatively an old hypothesis within the realm of quantum mechanics. I don't know what's going on in Frank Turek's mind, but I can only assume that this is an attempt to poison the well. Because when you say that something's new, that then opens the door for you to say, oh, well, you know, they just came up with this on the fly. They just decided that it existed, because it's new. It's new. How come we haven't heard about it before? It's new. So I don't know whether or not Frank Turek is just lying here, or if he's not educated on the topic of MWI. I'm going to go with the fact that he's not educated on MWI, because he likely only knows about MWI through the lens of atheist apologetics and not the actual science of the topic.
What it is a response to the fact that the universe appears to be so designed.
No, it is not. That is a complete and total lie. The multiple worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics arose from the results of the double slit experiment. The double slit experiment is a little too complex for me to get into in this video, and I would really rather pull up a slide. I'll put a video explaining the double slit experiment in the description below after I upload this video. But that is a complete and total lie on behalf of Frank Turek. The multiple worlds interpretation wasn't created because scientists said, oh, look at how well designed this is. No. Scientists took a look at the results of the double slit experiment, came up with quantum mechanics, and because we don't know enough about quantum mechanics, we started inventing interpretations of quantum mechanics. There are some 14 different interpretations of quantum mechanics. Multiple worlds interpretation is just one of them. Now, it would be very fair for anyone to comment below and say, well, Josh, doesn't that mean that multiple worlds interpretation has a 1 in 14 chance in being true? On the face of it, admittedly, yes. But I think it's worth considering that at the moment of this video being recorded, multiple worlds interpretations makes the least amount of assumptions, which, in my educated opinion, and for the record, I'm currently in a physics degree program, in my educated opinion, that would make multiple worlds interpretation the premier interpretation. In other words, it's the most favorable out of the 14. So when Frank Turek tells you that it's a response to the design argument, he's flat out lying. And that's because Frank Turek, the person, relies heavily on the universe being designed as an argument. Now, to quickly sort of patch that hole up, I don't think there's anything wrong with the universe having a design as an argument. However, multiple worlds interpretation and the universe having a design are not mutually exclusive. This is the critical error that the vast majority of people who look into these topics make, where they think that, oh, well, the universe can only exist singularly and have fine design, or it can have multiple worlds, in which case everything possible occurs. There's no contradiction between those two. It can be both.
Nobody would be thinking that there are other universes out there unless they realize, wow, this place is so designed, we've got to multiply our chances that this could have happened without intelligence if we're going to say there's no God.
That's not true. I say there's a God, and I say that there's multiple worlds, so clearly there's at least one instance of Frank Turek being wrong, and I have convinced a great many others that that's the case, and so I know of other cases in which Frank Turek is wrong. Again, people didn't come up with this argument in order to kill God. This isn't even an argument. This is a scientific hypothesis with empirical observations and a lot of math backing it up. So, again, maybe Frank Turek thinks this just because he's familiar with this notion under the guise of atheist apologetics, but what he is saying here is just not true. It is a complete and total straw man of MWI.
In fact, Paul Davies, who teaches at Arizona State University, who is a cosmologist, he's an agnostic. He doesn't know whether God exists or not, but he says the multiverse is a dodge. They're trying to avoid the obvious implication that the universe had a beginning by it appears to be a beginner. Now, here are some problems with the...
Again, through the guise of atheist apologetics, maybe. And I don't know much about this individual he just mentioned. Let's go back for a second and rehear that. Paul Davies. Let's quickly look him up. So after quickly looking him up, Paul Davies appears to be a physicist who teaches at Arizona State. But really all that tells us in regards to what Paul Davies actually has to say is that he doesn't subscribe to the multiple worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, and that he follows one of the other 14. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with that, except for, again, Frank Turek is sort of suggesting that because this one guy says it's bad, it's no good, and that's not how science works. That's just not how science works. Science doesn't operate by one person saying that it's this way and that's it. So, again, not a very strong argument.
Cosmologist. He's an agnostic. He doesn't know the obvious implication that the universe... book, by the way. First of all, there's no evidence for it. It's purely speculative.
That's false. Multiple worlds interpretation has about the exact same amount of evidence as any other interpretation of quantum mechanics. Hence why they are all equal interpretations of quantum mechanics. That's why we're calling them all interpretations. We don't know which one's correct, which means that they all have the same amount of technical proof than the other. I mean, with varying degrees, as science gets piled on, we get more evidence, obviously. So for him to say it's purely speculative, when, again, we've got the double slit experiment, which, if you're inclined, does count as evidence for the multiple worlds interpretation, then he's just straight up lying here, again.
You can't observe any of these universes.
Now, that is a verbal mistake on Frank Turek's part. Just because you can't observe something doesn't mean it's not real. And Frank Turek, being a believer in God, ought to know this. We don't observe God, and yet we both agree that he exists. Oh, we can't observe this God, so he must not exist. Eh, Frank? We can't observe Caesar crossing the Rubicon, yet we know he did. We don't observe the physical number one, yet we know it exists. So, this is a very, very bad argument to make. The notion that you can't observe it, therefore it doesn't exist, is a very bad argument, especially for anyone who believes in God. Very, very bad argument.
We have no way of knowing if they exist because
just like we have no way of knowing whether or not God exists. I can be an atheist apologist, coach. I'm ready.
We can only see our universe. Secondly, multiple universes would seem to multiply the need for a creator because each one would need...
No. First off, this assumes that the universes would require a creator. I, of course, agree that there is a creator, but this argument assumes that there's a creator, and typically in a logically consistent argument, we never want to make an assumption. Secondly, there are interpretations of multiple worlds that allow for universes to split from each other, essentially meaning that from the initial conditions of the beginning of time all the way to the end, things are essentially running on autopilot. No need for God to make any other universes beyond that. So, chalk this one up to not even knowing how multiple worlds really works, or if he does know how it works, he's operating with a very outdated version.
Or creation to get started, and as Vilenkin, Boot, and Guth found in their experiment, or their theory, which has been verified, even a multiverse needs an absolute beginning. So,
True. That is the first true thing he has said in this entire video. A multiverse would require an absolute beginning, because all universes would have to come from the initial singularity. Whatever that might look like or be. I just use the word singularity for lack of better descriptions. Yeah, that's just true.
So the Vilenkin-Bohr-Guth theorem, it's called, shows that space-time and matter had to have an absolute beginning. And even Vilenkin, this guy right here I quoted earlier, who has the book called Many Worlds in One from 2006, who believes that there maybe are other universes out there, even he admits, even if he's right, the whole show needs an absolute beginning. So it doesn't really seem to get rid of the problem that atheists...
Now note how argument 2 isn't really a good reason for why multiple worlds theory actually fails. There's no actual argument here for why multiple worlds can't exist, only that, it would still require all of them to come from a single beginning. That's not an argument for why multiple worlds fails. So we're in the very dangerous territory of word salad here, where nothing of substance is being presented, no actual arguments are being presented, and again, as I said at the beginning, there's no science here. Not a single scientific reason for why multiple worlds doesn't work.
Atheists are trying to avoid. You might ask who or what is producing these universes and keeping them from colliding.
That is a bad question, because the answer would be the natural forces of the universe. Who or what is keeping the Earth together? We don't know. It's a colossal mystery. We'll never figure it out. Gravity. The natural forces of existence are stopping these universes from colliding with each other. And again, this isn't an argument for why multiple worlds theory fails. This is just a question. So I don't get how anyone could watch this and sit down and think to themselves, "Wow, that's a good argument," because it's not an argument.
This multiplies causes beyond necessity.
It doesn't, because as you've just pointed out in your second argument, even a multiverse would need an absolute beginning, which means the number of causes comes down to 1. So, reason 4 and reason 2 are in contradiction with each other. Frank Turek very clearly didn't think this out, because he very clearly doesn't understand multiple worlds, which is what you get when you get someone who's not educated on physics simply regurgitating and summarizing what people who are educated on physics are saying. You get poor arguments that show you don't know what you're talking about. Bad method leads to bad results.
We heard of Occam's razor, where you're supposed to take you're not supposed to multiply causes when a simpler cause could be just a single creator.
Okay, so I can see why Frank Turek would think that Occam's razor would apply to the multiple worlds interpretation. The problem here is that, once again, earlier, Frank Turek admits that the multiverse would need an absolute beginning, and so we haven't added more. The initial cause isn't more complex or any less simple with multiple worlds included. So again, how is this an argument for how multiple worlds doesn't work? It's not.
Rather than all these multiple universes out there. And then finally...
Just because it's complex for you, Frank, doesn't mean it's complex for God. And that's a very important thing to note here. A very common mistake a lot of Christians make is, well, it's complex for me, I don't understand it. And then they proceed to build their theology around that. And the result is God essentially getting stupid within these people's worldview. So it's too complex for Frank Turek to believe that the universe could be managing all this stuff. Therefore, it's too complex even for God to have made. Why would we ever assume that's the case? If God really is God, the ultimate engineer, the ultimate artist, and the ultimate architect, why would we ever assume that he couldn't make something as complex and self-sustaining as this? Sounds to me as though we're attempting to sort of lessen what he's capable of doing. So, I can't help but think that Frank is essentially making the argument of, or the argument for a weaker God, essentially.
This is an atheist admission of evidence for design and the fact that design can be detected. That's why they're coming up with this theory, because...
Who's there? Who's they? What? I mean, so we're actually going to sit down and suggest that the ominous they, the atheist cabal, came up with the multiple worlds interpretation specifically because they don't like God? That's ridiculous. That is a ridiculous statement, and I cannot believe it came out of Frank Turek's mouth. I can't believe for a single second that I just heard that. So, what have we learned here? Well, we've learned that not knowing what you're talking about leads to some pretty poor argumentation. I don't have any personal beef against Frank Turek. I just think that this is really, really bad. And that there are better reasons not to believe in the multiverse. Because I can accept that people don't believe in the multiverse. It's not, as I stated earlier, it's not like a cut and dry thing. I'll give you a good example here. I once emailed Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones. He's another sort of rational theist here on YouTube. And I asked him whether or not he could ever consider multiple worlds as potential proof for free will, and his answer was, perhaps, comma, but I don't think there's a multiverse. That in and of itself is an entirely valid position to take. Because as stated, multiple worlds is just one of 14 interpretations. So, there are very easy positions you could take here to avoid multiple worlds, and Frank Turek is just choosing to take the least intellectual route for reasons I can't fathom. Which includes, but is not limited to, lying about multiple worlds interpretation, lying where it came from, and having inconsistent reasoning. So, in conclusion, be smart, be rational, and shalom aleichem.